Today's math lesson is for Lesson 27, Session 3, and I'm beginning this lesson on page 568. So we're going to start by reading our word problem and then discuss a couple of ways that you can actually solve this word problem. The problem states, Matt measures 2 insects. The bumblebee is 75 hundredths of an inch long. The hornet is 8/10 of an inch long. Which insect is longer? There are 2 different modelets that are represented on this page, and the first one is going to be a chart where we're actually using the hundredths and the tenths chart to show those 2 numbers. And it's important for you to always remember that tenths can be converted into hundredths, and hundredths can be converted into tenths to show equivalent numbers. So each large square is one whole, and the model shows 75 hundredths and 8/10. So here's the 75 hundredths, and then here's the 8/10. And you can actually see that more of the 8/10 is shaded in than the 75 hundredths. And another thing that I know is that an equivalent decimal to 8/10 is going to be 80 hundredths. And so if I were to shade, if this was a 100 chart, the exact same columns would be shading. So students might look at these 2 numbers when they're comparing 75 hundredths to 8/10 and say, well, 75 is greater than 8. But this would be an incorrect or inaccurate way to look at these numbers, because you would have to convert the 8/10 into hundredths, which would simply be adding another 0. And then you can see that since both the tenths and the hundredths columns are filled out, that the number 80 is indeed greater than the number 75. And this is what it shows you in the second modelet. So one way you can do it is by looking at a hundreds chart or a tenths chart. But I think it's really a lot easier, if you cannot visualize it yet on your own, to try to do the place value chart. So we put in the 75 hundredths, and then we put in the 8 for the 8/10 and just add a 0 as a placeholder. And again, you can see that if you just look in the tenths column, where we should always read these numbers left to right, you look in the ones column first to see if there's a number or not, and then you look in the tenths, the number the number that has the greater number in the tenths column is going to be your greater number to begin with. And so we know right here that 8 is greater than 7. Another way I like to look at it, yet the book hasn't exactly described it, is if I look at this number in its total as 75, and then this number below it as its total of 80, I also know that 80 is greater than 75. So 0.8 then is going to be greater than 0.75. And now we're going to move on to page 596. And this says, write fractions equivalent to 75 hundredths and 8/10. So we're writing fractions. And we know that because this is, excuse me, in the tenths and hundredths column, I can just write 75 over 100. And then I have 8/10 here. And when I convert that into the equivalent fraction with 100, on the denominator, I know that I'm going to get now 80 hundredths. And you can see very easily the comparison between the two, that 80 hundredths is greater than 75 hundredths. Therefore, 8/10 is greater than 75 hundredths. And remember too, anytime we, I'll save that for later. So number 2 says, how can you compare fractions with denominators of 110? So how do we actually do that? Well, we do that by finding the equivalent fraction. Finding equivalent fractions so that you're actually comparing with the same denominator. You want to convert to the same denominator. So I'm going to put that right here, convert to same denominator. And that's exactly what we've done here. We converted the 8/10 to the denominator of 100 so that we can then compare the 75 hundredths and the 8/10 easier. Number 3 says, what fraction with a denominator of 100 is equivalent to 8 tenths? Well, we found that above. It's right here, and that is 80 hundredths. So compare the fractions. Then compare 75 hundredths and 8 tenths using greater than, less than, or equal signs. So I actually already put those fractions up here at the top again, and we do know that 80 hundredths is greater than 75 hundredths. So, and now the question's asking us to use greater than, less than signs and the original decimals. And we're going to have that 75 hundredths is less than 8 tenths. And so then it asks which insect is longer, the bumblebee or the hornet. Well, the hornet is the one represented by the 8 tenths, so I'm going to write hornet in there. And it's important that we actually identify the insect, because that is what the question is asking. I shouldn't just write in the dimension, because that is not what the question is asking us to do right there. Number 5 says, how can you compare decimals when one is in tenths and the other is in hundredths? Well, the first thing I would do truly is I would use a place value chart. And then the second thing you can always do is if you have a number in the tenths, you can always add a 0 after the tenth. After the tenths place, so that you can see a number that is written as a tenth decimal. If you simply add a 0 after it, you can then see it written as a hundredths decimal. Okay, so now it's up to you to decide which model or strategy you think is best for comparing decimals when one is in tenths or hundredths, and it's up to you to explain. And I kind of did that above. I think a place value chart is best, and but at this point, because I've worked with decimals a lot more than you guys have, I simply know to add that 0 after a tenth to make it an equal decimal to a number that already has a tenths place. We're going to work on that more. So let's flip over to page 570. And our first problem here, our first example to go through together, says, which is greater, 9 tenths or 92 hundredths? Show how you can use fractions to solve the problems and show your work. So again, this one is asking us for fractions because I was about to go to a place value chart or just add the 0 behind the 9 in the first one, but it wants us to use fractions. So 9 tenths becomes 9 over 10, and 92 hundredths becomes 92 over 100, because this 2 is in the hundredths place. Now, we know that these denominators are different, so I have to change the tenths denominator to give it the denominator of 100. And when I do that, I'm multiplying by 10, and whatever you do to the bottom, you also have to do to the top numerator. And so now I have 90 hundredths. So I can see between the two fractions, 90 hundredths and 92 hundredths, that the 92 hundredths is greater than the 9 tenths. Now the question says which is greater, and it wants it in decimal form. So even though I've worked it out how it's asked me to, I have to answer the question how it wants me to answer it. So 9 tenths is less than 92 hundredths. And number 8 here, it's slightly different. It's using a number line, but we've been using number lines before, especially when we are comparing fractions. So this shouldn't technically be new using a number line. The locations of point B and C on the number line represent decimal numbers. Explain why the value point of C is greater than the value point of D. Well, one way we know that C is greater is because it's further to the right on the number line, right? So I'm going to put that. C is further to the right on the number line. And almost all number lines that are represented, the further right you go, you're increasing in value of some sort. I also know it's greater because the starting point that I start with is 6/10, and C is at 7/10. And then it's been broken up in the middle of all of the different numbers in between the two, and there's 9 between them because it counts by tens. So I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to get to my next whole number. So it's basically tenths, if that makes sense, within the tenths. So these is actually represented by hundredths. And like I told you before, if you want to visualize it differently, you can just add a 0 in that hundredths place. And so now I can see that 70 is greater than 66, or 70 hundredths is greater than 66 hundredths. Number 9 asks us to compare 37 hundredths and 4 tenths using greater than, less than, or equal than signs, and explain how you got your answer and show your work. So on this one, I would try to challenge you to use either a place value chart or a number line if that's what you want to do. And if you're representing it on a number line, you're probably going to start with 3 tenths, and you're going to end with 4 tenths, and we're going to break it up by tenths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this one would be 4 tenths. So then this would be 0.31, 0.32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, and then we're at 4 tenths. Another thing you can do and visualize already as well is that because I have a number that's written in hundredths, I can just add my extra 0 to these tenths so that now it looks like a number that I can compare. And ultimately, I know that 37 hundredths is less than 4 tenths. Because if I were to look at them equally, 37 and 4, 0 on a place value chart, this is my ones, this is my tenths, and my hundredths. The 4 is the greater number here, greater than 37. So there are a couple different ways. We can look in the tenths column to figure out which one's greater. We can add a 0 after the tenths so that both numbers we're comparing have 2 digits. You can draw a number line as well to help you. So at this point, you're ready to complete page 571 and 572.